And so, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the Leonardo da Vinci, the Salvator Mundi, the masterpiece by Leonardo of Christ the Saviour, previously in the collections of three kings of England. At 110 million, we'll give you 120, give you 140, 130 million, 140 million is bid at 140 million.
I always thought it would be the most expensive work of art ever sold. It's incredible and unbelievably rare. Nothing conjures with the name of Leonardo. We had tens of thousands of people on 3 continents line up for hours in some cases, and people were tremendously excited to see it.
I had a relationship with the Salvator Mundi, and he had one with me. This was an incredibly powerful image, and it was like nothing that I've ever worked on, and I believe like nothing that's ever been painted. I've known Robert Simon for a very long time, and Robert had purchased the painting sometime, I think it was in April of 2005. He called and asked if he could bring a picture over that he had just purchased. And I asked Bob if he wanted me to go ahead and clean it. It had very recent kind of sticky varnish on it and some sloppy retouching that also looked quite recent.
It was heavily overpainted, and it was thought to be a copy, and it was sold for a couple $1,000s at an estate sale in Louisiana. It was found by a man named Alex Parrish, who then sold a share of it to Robert Simon, who is a very distinguished authority on Italian Renaissance paintings. Thought he must be crazy when he said he thought he might have found Leonardo da Vinci. And they started having it cleaned, and at that point the quality of it really began to come through, and they got quite excited, and they brought in Diane Modestini, who's a very distinguished restorer in New York.
I was not thinking, this is by Leonardo. I was just concentrating on what had to be done to make the picture legible, not to lose any of the original. It just didn't enter my mind. It probably would have interfered with my ability and my freedom to work on it and to, develop kind of a working relationship with it. We noticed that the panel itself had a very large crack that ran the whole length of the panel from top to bottom. It was a curve that went right around the side of the Salvator Mundi's head. And that was, kind of a horrifying thing to discover. The other parts of the painting were preserved perfectly.
I'd already been hearing rumors from Leonardo scholars who had seen it, who were sort of hinting that they had seen this kind of amazing thing. A consensus developed over time that this really was this lost original that had been thought to have disappeared for centuries. By the time he paints it around 1500, Leonardo is almost 50. He's the most famous artist in the world. There is an assumption that it must have been for a very important patron. He used very, very precious materials, and he finishes it, which he doesn't do that often. He starts a lot and abandons it along the way, but he finishes this. First absolutely known history of it is about 100 years later, when it's in the collection of Charles I of England. He dies hugely in debt, and the crown decides to give away much of his art collection in repayment of his debts. It's given to Mason, who would be the equivalent of an architect or a builder named John Stone, in repayment for this debt. And 9 years later, when the monarchy is restored and Charles II becomes king, Parliament passes an act that says, basically, all you people who had debts from the king and got stuff from us, give it back. And so it enters the collection of Charles II. It then descends to his younger brother and successor, James II. His mistress is a woman named Catherine Sedley, and they have a child together, and she inherits it from him. And then she marries the first Duke of Buckingham, who builds Buckingham House, which eventually, by their heirs, is sold and is now Buckingham Palace. And when the house is sold to the crown, the contents of it are sold off at an auction in 1763. And at that point, it just completely disappears. We have no idea what happened. It's sold as by Leonardo, but for a very small amount of money. And so it's probable that even by that point, the painting had been quite heavily overpainted.
I worked on it off and on for 5 years. The cleaning was really not particularly revelatory because the head had been completely repainted. It was a beard. It looks quite grotesque. But wherever there were damages, they just made this kind of red beard. But all of that was done, I don't know, in the not-so-distant past, and it came off very easily.
286 million. Will you give me 290? I thought so. 300 million.
From 1763, we have no idea from that point on what happens to it. Until the end of the 19th century, when it reappears and it's sold to a very eminent British collector, Francis Cook. But it's sold as a copy or a follower of Leonardo. And you can see it's heavily overpainted. It was sort of just made to look more masculine. I think it was probably seen as more fitting by the 19th century. And it remains in the Cook collection where nobody pays much attention to it until 1958, when it's sold at Sotheby's in London for £45. It's bought by an American, we think, and it ends up in collections in America until 2005, when it's sold for, again, a very, very small amount of money as a copy in Louisiana.
It wasn't until I was at the very, very end of the restoration, and there was one retouch around the mouth, which was extremely difficult. I had a book about technical investigations of the Mona Lisa, detailed reproductions, and one was just of the Mona Lisa's mouth. So I actually cut the page out of the book and tacked it to my easel. That was the moment when I had to say to myself, of course it's by Leonardo, because nobody else paints this way. This picture is a paradigm of everything that he knew technically about painting, and much of what he thought about time, eternity, and the cosmos. It wasn't just a portrait of Jesus Christ painted for the king. This was something that became very important to him.
For those of you following online, you may not have heard it. The bid was 350 was called on the telephone at 350 million for Leonardo Salvator Mundi.
The fact that it went for so much money will protect it.
$370 million, they said. 400 million.
I only care about it being protected and it being one of the most important expressions in paint that Leonardo left us about his thinking. So the price doesn't matter.
In my dreams, it's sort of almost exactly what I thought it would sell for. I always thought it would make the biggest price ever. So it was a trophy of the greatest rarity.
Leonardo Salvator Mundi selling here at Christie's. $400 million is the bid, and the piece is sold.